Good morning. So the title of this overall conference, not just this session you're lucky to be in today, is Leadership Opportunities and Challenges for Our Nation's Courts. I would like a show of hands as to who encountered a leadership challenge courtesy of CrowdStrike. All right, keep them up. Keep your hand up if you were stuck in an airport for at least 2 hours trying to get here. 4, 6.
Oh, wow.
Anyone spend the night in an airport just to be here to see Ms. Lewis? Me neither. But I did have 8 hours on Friday trying to get here. I had hoped to see, I hadn't been to New Orleans as a tourist before, and I had hoped to spend the weekend checking it out, and CrowdStrike said no, and I was unable to overcome that leadership challenge and got in yesterday. But I want to welcome you all here and thank you for making the effort to attend this conference despite the obstacles that Microsoft and others threw in your way. As I was introduced, I am a trial judge. A lot of what we're going to focus on today is the impact of what we do in courts on people outside that court experience. And it is an area that may not be novel to you as you think about it and as we talk about it, but it is certainly novel to the court system in thinking about it in a structured and an integrated way. And so I think one of the sessions later today is about ChatGPT in courts and what do we do with that. Today's session here in Churchill C is going to be similar to that in that we aren't presenting answers. We are presenting a way to think about things and an opportunity. That's the challenges and opportunities. An opportunity for our court systems to be thinking more carefully and thoughtfully about the impact we have on children when parents and caregivers move through the court system, and opportunities we may have to connect those children with sources of care. It is not necessarily a court-centered solution, but is an opportunity for courts to help those service providers connect with those children. So I just want to give you an overview. If you were thinking, hey, when I leave here, I'm going to bring home a toolkit to my court system to deal with the impact of the incarceration of parents and caregivers. No such luck, just like if you attend that ChatGPT session, they're not going to give you the answer on how courts should handle AI. But it's certainly high time for us to begin thinking about that. So that's my introductory spiel. Anything you want to add?
No, just that I think the one thing I will say, one, it's nice to be among family and friends. This is my, you are my people. And even though I don't work in courts anymore, Judge, I'm gonna move away from you.
Yeah.
Even though I don't work in courts anymore, it's my first love. And so being back here feels very, very, very good. Also, Judge McBurney and I worked together. We were a chief judge, court administrator pair during my time in Fulton County. And so if you notice that we'll finish each other's sentences, that's why. So just wanted to mention that.
It is how I survived my 2 years as chief judge. So the Atlanta Judicial Circuit is Fulton County, which is the largest county population-wise in Georgia, over 1 million people. We got a couple of Fulton folks here. Any other one from Georgia? I recognize my Fulton folks. We got a few other Georgians.
Yeah.
All right, go Peach State. So the Atlanta Judicial Circuit is the largest population-wise. It's the busiest. It's also the capital circuit. So we get lots of litigation involving someone suing the state. And running that court as the court administrator was quite the challenge. And I benefited greatly from Ms. Lewis's steady hand and keeping me out of trouble. But it also exposed me and our court system to some things that happen outside the court. The introduction mentioned this Justice and Mental Health Task Force. And that was an opportunity for judges to start working with city and county officials, NGOs, and care providers dealing with the impact of being involved with the criminal justice system in terms of mental health and looking for ways in which we could divert folks out of the criminal justice system when there was a mental health crisis. It's not necessarily jail someone because he's in crisis, but connect him or her with care. So when Ms. Lewis reached out and said, I've got this great new thing I'm working on in my latest job, and it's the impact of incarcerating parents and caregivers on the kids who aren't even coming into court yet. What can we do about that? I said, let's see. Maybe we can come up with a presentation. So Let's start with the kids. This is the focus of what we want to discuss today. Our general image of kids are carefree, running around playing baseball or gymnastics, or actually my kids, it's like this with their little screen. I don't know if your kids already have college football 25. We were having dinner last night and I got this, my kid doesn't call me so much, he usually texts, but my phone rang. It was my older son. So I said, hey, hold on for a second. And the free trial of college football 25 had run out. So it's time for Dad's credit card number. Dad, I can't play anymore. I used up to 10 hours. But we think of kids as enjoying something like that. Let's play online. Let's be with our friends. Let's learn. They're a product of their environment. What we don't think about is the impact of what's going on with their parents on them so much. And we want to start thinking about that because the numbers we're going to get into, and in particular the health data that Ms. Lewis is going to share with you, is that one of the most traumatic things that can happen to a child as he or she is growing up is to have this loss of a parent to the criminal justice system. Knowing that dad is out there, but he's not accessible. It's not safe to go see him, or he's somewhere 200 miles away. And the numbers are staggering. You can see it on this slide here. And these are preliminary numbers. Don't run home and say, hey, McBurney said 4 in 10, so that means it's exactly 40%. We are exploring this problem, and there are organizations like Ms. Lewis's and the Anne E. Casey Foundation where they're just beginning to quantify the scope of this issue. The impact is pretty well known, how deleterious it is for a child to have mom or dad locked up. But the numbers are staggering. 4 in 10 is the estimate of the number of children who, during their childhood, have one or more adults in their household arrested, sent to prison, convicted of a felony. And in any of those scenarios, you're locked up for at least a little bit. And a couple things about this slide. We're going to use parent as shorthand, but we all know that there are many forms of households, and it may not be the biological parent who is the caregiver, the primary caregiver for the children in that household. It might be a multi-generational household. It might be that grandma or auntie who actually isn't related, but she's called Auntie so-and-so, and that's the caregiver. When that person is arrested and taken out of the picture, that causes trauma, and that's the issue we're looking at. I also know from having worked in the courts for 10 years that the biological father might get arrested, and that has limited impact on that household because he's not in the household. I'll ask him when it's sentencing time, do you have any kids? And I have defendants who will say, I have 3 or 4, I'm not sure. Those kids may not be as directly affected. Okay, but that's not our focus here. It's when there is a caregiver who is that meaningful person to the children that is the focus of what we're doing. And just to further put it in a context, it is more common for a child to go through the trauma of having a parent arrested and pulled from that household, or caregiver arrested, than it is for a child to have asthma, to need corrective lenses, or fortunately to suffer from cancer. But it is such a common situation that it cries out for us to be thinking about it a little more carefully. And again, we are where the parent gets taken and is working through the criminal justice process. What we need to think about collectively is how can we notify, connect with the resources on the outside. This is not a pitch to you all to say the courts need to come up with a child treatment program. That's not within our scope. It's not within our resources. But we're not helping anyone by turning our backs on it to say, hey, there probably are collateral consequences every time someone moves through the criminal justice system in our courthouse, but it doesn't happen in here, so it's not our problem. It's the community's problem, of which we are an important institution. And so our pitch to you all is we need to be thinking proactively about steps we can take to identify these situations and alert folks who can do something about it. We have slides towards the end of the presentation about examples of where this is beginning to happen.
Perfect. So as we kind of talk through today, I don't think Judge McBurney or I have to kind of convince you that it's a justice issue. What we do want to impress upon you is that it's a health issue. And I will tell you, the CEO of our organization, Andy Keller at Meadows, he said, you know, Yolanda, you keep pushing all of these ideas about what we should do differently in the justice system. Well, funding the justice system sometimes is not sexy. You know, it's not a sexy thing, right? How many of you try to write grants and sometimes you just get turned down? Or how many times have you heard, well, we don't want your defendants in this housing area? You know, there are all types of obstacles. What seems to be a little better of an approach, though, is that people tend to respond to health issues, right? When we go to the doctor, we think about, you know, our health is preventative. People want to see how they can help you. And that's one of the reasons why we're trying to translate this conversation into a health issue as opposed to thinking about it independently as just a justice issue. And it requires a lot of leadership. It requires, I think we all remember when drug courts were not a thing, right? Do y'all remember that? I know we're live streaming, so I hope this lands well. But you remember when people were like, it's just a hug a thug type thing? Well, Judge McBurney and I were just talking and we were like, well, why not hug a kid, right? That's important too. But it takes leadership and being in these rooms to really kind of translate that into something differently. So today we're going to talk a little bit about the scale of the problem. We're going to talk about it from the perspective of national data, but also some local data, just to put that into perspective for you. We're also going to talk about social determinants of health. Y'all know I'm a court person. I am not a health person. But when you translate kind of information back and forth, some of the health issues sounds just like the justice issues. Some of the justice concerns sound just like the health issues. So it'll be kind of normal speak. You'll know a lot of the things that we're talking about. And then we're going to talk about the actual impact on children, what they're experiencing, what type of stigma happens to them, at what age they start to kind of feel like they are spiraling out of control, and what that looks like in schools and our communities and et cetera. Judge McBurney is going to talk about a little bit what he talked about, looking inward, how we are kind of focused on the defendant in front of us when we really need to think about all of the tentacles. Children have parents, and those parents sometimes stand before us. And so really thinking about it in a holistic way. And then thinking about opportunities to engage you. What are you doing in your local jurisdictions, along with telling you some of the work that we're doing in some of our jurisdictions. So let me just reiterate what he said. This is an opportunity for us to increase knowledge and really amplify the issue. We do not have the answers. But secondly, because I'm a former trial court administrator, I know how powerful this room is. I know that when you hear something and you hear a problem and you get back to your jurisdictions and you can work with your judges and your staff and your teams, change can happen. And so part of this is really kind of sparking ingenuity and really kind of figuring out what we can do differently for children in need.
And this is meant to be interactive, so there is, if time permits, at the end a slide that says questions and discussion, and we can talk then. But if at any point we say something that doesn't make sense or sparks a question, feel free to raise a hand. And there's a young lady running around with a microphone. I think this is a live stream, so you'll need to ask your question to the microphone so that those who are joining us who couldn't get past CrowdStrike's challenge will be able to hear what your question is. But don't be shy. If you do have one, we'll pause and take that question and make up an answer to it. So with that, let's talk a little bit about the scope of incarceration in the United States. And I don't care what your political flavor is, and we're certainly not getting into that today, whether you want to make America great or you're for Harris plus question mark in the coming election. One thing we do very, very well, and I put that in quotation marks, in America is lock people up. Apart from a few countries that you wouldn't want to live in, we have a higher rate of incarceration per capita than any country in the world. And amongst the OECD, the developed countries, we're in a stratosphere above everyone else. That's the way in which the United States has decided to address certain issues, is to lock people up. And so, anyone here from Nebraska? On any given day in the United States, there are more people in our local jails and prisons than the state of Alaska. That's the scope of incarceration. If you locked everyone up in Nebraska, you would create the same current population of incarcerated individuals. And on an annual basis, that means, because some people are in prison for life, so you're part of that 2 million, you're going to be there until you pass away. But on any given year, just under about 500,000 people go into prison, and over 7 million arrests, as in you go into jail, occur every year. That doesn't mean it's 7 million different people. I know well from the work I do, we have what we call familiar faces, people who might get arrested 6 times a year. They're arrested because they are working through a mental health crisis. They're at a gas station where they've been told to stay away from. 911 instead of 988 is called. The police show up, lock the person up, and 3 months later, he's back at that gas station. But what we see is 7-8 million people a year, or arrests a year occurring. Of course, there are disparities in these arrests and these imprisonments. Over 2/3 of the prison population is black or brown, only 1/3 of the country's population. Separate lecture for another time as to why there is that disproportionate impact, but it does inform, and there'll be a slide about this later on, the communities where we want to start looking for children who are in need. You don't go to Beverly Hills 90210 to look for kids who need help because their parents have been incarcerated. There are zip codes I could rattle off in Fulton County where you have a situation you would have much more success if you're going into those schools or those community centers or those churches to say, let's be thoughtful about how we can support households where a caregiver has been arrested. Another depressing fact, you don't have to go back, but it's not on this slide, but in this vein, the average length of stay if you're arrested, this isn't if you get convicted, this is if you're arrested. County jail, city jail is where you typically are, presumption of innocence, but you can't make bond or you have no bond. Prison, you've already been adjudicated, and in theory, due process has said you're guilty and you serve your time. The average jail stay is 3 weeks. You're arrested for a DUI, it's overnight. Your kid may not even know you got locked up. Daddy went out, and when the kid wakes up, you're back, and you're $500 poorer because you had to post a bond. But that's not a big impact. But the average stay is almost a month. And so if you are the breadwinner for a household with 3 kids, and you hit that average or just above average, you're out of that household for a month. You have kids who don't have a fresh set of clothes. Where's the food coming from? Are they even going to school? Or are they just doing this all day because no one's saying take them to school? The average length of a jail stay is 3 weeks. And in my state, that's probably going to grow, and you may see trends like this in other states. They recently passed legislation that greatly restricted signature bonds, which is a way where there's a low-level offense and you're trying to connect someone back with his or her family because they don't necessarily pose a big threat, and there are good reasons for them to be out pending adjudication of their charges. Signature bond, just sign here. Your word is your bond, and I think you'll be back here because you care about your household. And the legislature added dozens and dozens of offenses for which you cannot issue a signature bond. I will tell you the number of people in our county jail who've got a $500 bond and can't make it is growing and growing. And there's not a fix for that. So this situation will only get worse insofar as that's the legislative push. I'm not saying it's a good or bad legislation, but I promise you that those legislators, when they were thinking about the safety of the community, we don't want bonds to go to repeat offenders, they were not thinking about the children left behind. Because that's just not the voice that comes up in these discussions. But that's one of the takebacks for all of you. Not that you need to go lobby your legislature to do anything, but just in thinking about what happens in courts, being aware of the impact outside of the courts. All right, next slide. So this is the top 10 states in the United States for per capita incarceration. And we highlighted Texas and Georgia. Georgia, my state, Texas, where Ms. Lewis works, not necessarily her home state. Our host is actually number 2. We didn't want to highlight that and get run out of the room. But this just shows you the magnitude of the issue we've got. Incarceration is persistent, and it's not going to stop anytime soon. These are big numbers, and it generates new arrests every day, new prison populations every month. And if we assume that the triggering event for the children is the arrest and the pulling the person out of the household, you can see that this is something that we need to figure out. Now, another interesting lecture for another day, if we ever get invited back. If we were to look at the bottom 10, mostly New England states, Vermont, New Hampshire, Massachusetts, as in they incarcerate the fewest per 100,000, their crime rates are no higher than in Georgia or Texas or Alabama or Montana or these states. So there is no correlation between, Georgia's a safer state to live in than Vermont. Not for today, but something to be thinking about. Next slide, please. Oh, here we are. We have been talking about the gross numbers. People who get arrested, are incarcerated, are jailed. Parents or not parents. And if the universe of those locked up were childless adults or adults whose children were grown, we wouldn't have the issue we're talking about. But Ms. Lewis and her team were able to get slightly more granular data. And again, we don't track it much, and so it's not great data yet, but we hope to get it better and better. This bar chart, will be on the next slide as well, breaks down total population of state prisoners, so people who've been adjudicated guilty, and breaks it down to, are you a parent or not? And so all the way to the right is total male state prison population, and the light blue bar are males with no kids, and the dark bar are males with kids. So you can see most of the men in state prison don't have kids. It's reversed for females. Now, there are many, many, many fewer females in state prison, but the reality is the majority, it's more likely than not, if I send a woman to state prison, I'm leaving children behind. She is leaving children behind. That doesn't mean she shouldn't be sentenced, but there is that collateral effect. It is more likely than not, when a woman goes to prison, there are children left behind. And these are children who are under 18 years old, so minors, not a 32-year-old child. If we think about the number of kids, it starts to get scary. The Annie E. Casey Foundation estimates that there are over 5 million children who live in a household who have had a parent or caregiver arrested or locked up at some point during their childhood. 5 million kids who are working through something like that.
And Judge, can I just add a couple of things?
You may.
One, I just want to point out the data. Judge McBurney keeps saying that we don't have a lot of data. The actual study in 2016 has been the only study that we can find that actually shows the breakdown of individuals who have kids and don't have kids. Now we're going off of 2016 data. There have been a lot of crime trends kind of during and post-COVID. We are experiencing changes and shifts in our cities across the country. And so we don't know exactly how many people are actually there now who have children, but I think it's telling that only one study has been done. And if you ask local jurisdictions, courts, and we'll talk about this a little bit later, most jurisdictions aren't tracking this either. They may track it in juvenile court, but they're certainly not tracking it on the adult side. And I'm really excited to tell you a little bit about if that many people have children, we're going to talk family actually experiencing incarceration. So likely that 46 and 58% total includes people who have had parents, grandparents, and maybe even their own children who are now engaging with the system.
So this is our last data slide before we get into the health impacts on children of having a caregiver incarcerated, but it's a great segue. Same bar chart, but getting more granular into the state of Texas. What the Texas Juvenile Justice Department has determined, and this is measuring, if you will, almost too late, that 70% of the boys and girls who go into a juvenile detention facility in Texas, 70% of boys and girls who end up in juvenile detention facilities have a parent who got locked up. that is so far beyond correlation, and that's where you know we need to be thinking about things differently. And more importantly, we need to be interceding sooner, because we're gathering that data when? After a kid has been locked up. That means pulled out of the house, pulled out of the school. Yes, sir. Yep, it happens to be right next to you. A perfect point.
I apologize for busting in before you were done. I didn't mean to do that, but
I had good flow too.
you did. You're flowing well, man. I apologize.
That's all right.
But at this point, you can get even sooner. We did a year's worth of data of kids who got adjudicated delinquent in New Jersey. Then we look back in our family system to see how many of them we've seen before. Out of all those kids, 15% of them had been a juvenile delinquent before.
Yeah.
The rest had been part of a divorce, part of a child support, part of domestic violence, part of all those other things. So you don't have to wait for the kid to get adjudicated delinquent and arrested. Those indicators way back then proved to us that we need to do something for those kids then. And I apologize again for breaking your flow.
No. That's beautiful. We'll get to you in 1 second. There's a slide we're going to get to that you're going to say, that's what I just said.
Yeah.
We 100% need to get to it sooner. In fact, ideally, the triggering event is dad gets arrested, assuming dad is a meaningful part of that household and outreach occurs. This is far, far too late. The point is simply how impactful in a negative way the parental incarceration is. But you're exactly right. And it's not just a parent being incarcerated. We've got a chart that talks about, well, what's happening in your family court? What's happening in Georgia? It's magistrate court where evictions occur. Mm-hmm. Well, that's going to be a traumatic event for a kid if he's having to move from here to there and maybe going to a shelter. And so then we need to start connecting the child with resources. So thank you for flagging that, and we are going to get there. Sir, did you have a question or comment?
Take it a step before the delinquent stage. Oh,
Yes.
excuse me. To take it a step before the delinquent stage, we look at our system in Nashville, in the juvenile system. And before they become delinquent, they usually start out as dependent and neglected children.
Yes.
And you could see a correlation between whether or not a child was N&D, what we call neglected and dependent, whether or not that person was going to become delinquent and later end up in the adult system.
Right.
Yeah, one of the things I love about being in these rooms, and one of the things we want you to think about, yes, what happens when they are in the justice system, when they're in our juvenile courts, but also it's okay for us to kind of create strategies that says, if you are not in juvenile court and you're with grandma and auntie, you still deserve to have access to care. Let's activate that so we don't have to break down the data around your delinquency. And what you'll see, and I love kind of, Judge McBurney and I have been talking about this for so long, this data is going to get super granular, like what age group that you start to see these challenges for kids that are now acting out. And I always reference back to this book called There Are No Bad Kids, but with the lack of structure, care, access to the basics, kids will act out in school. And sometimes that is seen as delinquent behavior when it's really just a call for help or a cry out for help to get access to the things they need. They just don't know how to ask for it. And so this is part of our thinking about, like, they're children, right? We're adults. We manage these systems. How can we help with that outcry without kind of overstepping our bounds, but at least giving them some level of access to care? So that's what we're going to talk a little bit about, what the health system looked like.
And we have another question before you do that.
I was just, as you were speaking about that, I was thinking of multiple JDI efforts. I know being an educator and working in a lot of equity spaces, connecting schools to, deterrent kind of options within like paper arrest versus physical arrest. That was able to drop a lot of those statistics, but I think that was also during COVID period too, where they had to be inventive and think kind of outside the box. And so some of those were really good intersections to boost it up, arrest of juveniles and offenders in that way too. Yeah. So maybe that proactive approach could help mitigate.
Yeah, I think this is all about preventative. So in the health system, it's all about preventative care. And so what we are trying to kind of get ourselves to is this idea that we can also think in a preventative way that really health models have benefited for a long time. So anybody familiar with ACEs? Do you? Wonderful. Is that because you work in the juvenile court, or how are you familiar? If you work in juvenile court, you used to work in juvenile court. Where? Domestic violence, obviously. Education. Problem-solving courts. Right. So I think most of us have started to access this information around adverse childhood experiences. For those of you who are not as familiar, it's really this idea that at a very early age, children can experience these very traumatic and stressful events that really change the trajectory of who they are, how they interact with the world, and really the level of health impact it has on their lives. Now, there are a lot of different ACEs. I think some of you have talked about them. Domestic violence is one of those. If you grew up in a house where there was domestic violence, community violence, witnessing individuals being exposed to high levels of violence. We've had some children, from the research that is done with some of the colleagues at Meadows, say that children have these adverse responses when they are walking to school, but they walk past a dead body or witness a shooting. So community violence is also an ACEs. If you're thinking about abuse and neglect, I think somebody said that earlier, those are all adverse childhood experiences, and they carry with us kind of throughout the lifespan, and parental incarceration is one of them. Now, what does that mean? So, I had to get really familiar with kind of these health settings, and one of the things I asked one of my colleagues who works in the pediatric care space, I said, when a child goes into the doctor, do they ask about ACEs? And she said, yes, most of the time they do. I said, do they ask about parental incarceration? Not likely. So it's okay for us to ask, does mom and dad fight? It's okay for us to say, are you feeling okay? Do you have a home? But it's not as clear around why we don't ask much around parental incarceration when we know that 33% of the people who are actually in jail now, in prison now, actually had parents or someone who took care of them who actually also experienced the same thing. And so it's a risk factor, and it has significant consequences on the mental and physical health of children. Now, we talk a lot about children, but I think the sub-notes are very important. In that, we talk about ACEs as an adverse childhood experience, but it follows you through adulthood. And you'll see, we'll talk a little bit about the first opportunity. I think NAMI has indicated that 50% of children, 50% of mental health, like lifelong mental health conditions, actually manifest by age 14. Age 14. Adverse childhood experience multiplies that. So if you think about it, folks kind of take this into their adulthood. Now, I don't know too much about the evidence. Of course, kind of getting into this space, I don't know if this is kind of correct, but some of the data show that there are differences in the impact it has by race. Again, I think it's traumatic no matter what race you are. And so I don't know if physical health or mental health, should be disproportionately kind of separated because it has a lot of impact kind of overall. And the last thing, we talked about like what happens in homes where children are impacted. These are homes that are already experiencing problems maybe with poverty, lack of housing, or transient housing, where they are kind of moving back and forth from one space to the other. The parents usually have had educational challenges, which makes it hard for them to have living wage jobs. And children are experiencing all of this independently within the households that they are in. And I think one of the things we really thought was fascinating is that adolescent children with a history of parental incarceration consistently have higher levels of problems in their school environments and community environments between grades 5th and 10th. That's what the 11 to 16 age group. For those of you who work in juvenile justice, what is your highest group of kids coming in with challenges? Does it fall within some of these grades primarily? Right, so it's when it's really kind of that school age when you're kind of interacting with the world, you're trying to find your place in the world, you're trying to find structure and friends, connections to the community, connections to others, and sometimes that connection starts to look differently than we would like to. That first slide that Judge McBurney said, we wanted to be happy and engaged. It doesn't always look like that. And then the third thing here is that, whenever there is a break between the parent and child household, you start to see mental health challenges develop. Antisocial behavior. If you look at some of the circumstances where you've seen, at least I know in the Uvalde situation, they kind of start to talk about kids and their antisocial behavior. Like they don't talk to other kids. They kind of keep to themselves. They are seen as the weird or the not so cool kid. All of those things kind of go into this idea of trying to figure out if the person needs help or if this is something that we're overlooking. So these antisocial behaviors are something that happens in this group of kids. Now, the last thing I want to introduce to you as kind of a health conversation, which we've seen a lot of, is this idea of ambiguous loss. Anybody familiar with ambiguous loss? One person, the person in domestic violence court. Anybody else? Ambiguous loss? Ever heard of it? Okay, perfect, Judge. So you have... I'm not alone. You're not alone. You're not alone. So ambiguous loss is a very interesting term in the health space that I've kind of become familiar with through this work. Ambiguous loss is when there is a loss of physical contact, but it's not a death. So you kind of start to feel like confused. You don't know what's going on. It kind of feels like the person is supposed to be there, but they're untouchable, they're unreachable. And that's something that happens for children who have parents who are incarcerated. Now, the difference between the two is when there is an experience of a death, right? When someone dies, you've experienced that, it's clear, it's conclusive, you understand that the person is not coming back, you can kind of get your brain around the fact that that's a loss. It's a tangible loss that you can quantify. For kids, when parents are removed out of the home, they can't quantify it. There's no closure. They don't know when dad or mom is coming home. They don't know who they're going to be staying with. They kind of miss mom and dad. They don't know kind of what this justice system is. Why do I have to go and engage with, stay at grandma's house or engage with the courts? And so there's a lot of confusion around what that loss looked like. But this is the important piece. No matter if it's clear or unclear, there's evidence to suggest that ambiguous loss has the same level of response as if a person died. So just put that into perspective. So even though, there was not an actual death, mom, dad going to jail or being away for a period of time creates the same level of anxiety and grief and trauma as if they had died. And so I think really kind of putting this into a different perspective, really thinking about it from a health perspective, and there are things that can help us actually name what we're seeing in our courts, is very helpful when you're trying to engage with your local care providers and saying, hey, I think this kid is experiencing grief, or can you train us on grief and trauma therapy, those things, because they can quantify it. So this is a matrix of consequences, and you probably can't read the writing. I'll buy you lunch if you can read the writing. You can read it? You have better eyes. I'm close and I can't read it. But what this is really kind of a matrix of consequences. And the reason we put this here is really just to highlight the idea that this is not a justice issue. Where's justice up here? Yeah. So it's not that we're taking you out of the mix. We're just saying there are so many opportunities to engage kids and so many circumstances that are happening in families way before they get to the justice system, way before they start to interact with us. And it happens in their families. We know that, kids who are experiencing this are subject to have PTSD. At a very young age, we know that they are likely to be put in foster care and adopted and kind of moved away from their families. In the educational setting, they're seen as disruptive. They're seen as kind of low performing, all of those things that really and if no intervention happens in any of these quadrants, that's when the non-existent quadrant, the hidden piece here is that then you start to see them in the justice system, because all of the other opportunities where there could have been interventions maybe outside of the system, whether that is housing or having, a good job so that you're able to have well-paying opportunities to support your family. And Judge tells this really amazing story, so I'm gonna ask him to tell it, maybe, about a gentleman who was kind of engaged in his court who really wanted to do well, but had some economic issues around his employment that kind of led him back to the system, and he had children in a household. And so we'll talk a little bit about that. And then the pediatric care piece. The earliest point we know that you can kind of start to engage kids is when they're coming into doctors. But that's provided that they have a doctor, because sometimes in the communities that we serve, they don't have access to their own primary care doctors. So I just wanted to kind of just make sure you understand that there's a lot happening outside of the court space, but we're kind of the centerpieces where everything really happens and comes together. But the hope is that we can start to think about how to work with community care providers really upstream to kind of head some of that off in the need to come into the justice system.
Add one more layer to that. You don't have to put the slide back up because it was intimidating. But one of the takeaways when I was reading through that is how long-term the impact is. We're thinking about helping the kid right then and there. And if you don't, I found that if I turn mine off when you're talking, but yours is hard to, never mind.
Can't reach
yours
it,
is
so
like embedded in your spine. Okay. We'll just have a little
not gonna
feedback.
happen.
That's all right. You just stay way over there.
Yep.
Is the long-term impact, the loss of opportunities that these young boys and girls will have because they get knocked off cycle. Maybe the kid was doing okay in school. Maybe the kid was going to school. A parent or a caregiver is taking out of the picture. The kid starts acting out and maybe has an initial interaction with juvenile court, not multiple, but you see this person getting knocked off a trajectory where maybe she would have graduated from high school, but we're decreasing the likelihood that that would happen. Maybe there was a chance of going to college. We're decreasing the likelihood that that would happen when we leave untreated the trauma that is caused. I'm looking back at the tech guy there. Is there any fix to that? It's my natural electricity. I have this problem.
It's electric.
Yeah. But it is a slight change at age 11 becomes a huge change at age 25, and all those missed opportunities if that trauma isn't addressed early on. And so that just highlighted to me as Ms. Lewis was going into these impacts, the importance of trying to get there so soon after the trauma occurs, and not, to the original point, when they finally make it to a state detention facility for juveniles. That's too late. I mean, we know the outcomes of kids who go through state detention facilities for juveniles. They're not good. They're terrible. And so we need to make that connection much, much earlier to avoid, if you envision that matrix, sort of it spreading out deeper and deeper into that kid or that household's life.
And by the way, I don't think we talk about this, but we don't think that this is going to work for all kids. So we'll get down into kind of the impacts on the court. It's not going to be every child that even access some level of care that they will change. And, we talk about mental health doesn't make you violent, right? Like that's not, you may engage in behavior, but that's not naturally how you kind of think about mental health. But mental health has a lot of impacts that can lead you to some tenable circumstances. And part of this is where we can find opportunities to assess and intervene. We really should be thinking about that in a community, as a community response.
Right. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what, for those of you who are active inside courts that deal with criminal cases, should be pretty obvious, but it sort of explains how we ended up where we are right now, which is, although it sounds like some jurisdictions are already a step ahead, how it was that we never really were thinking about this. And it's the inward focus you have, I don't mean to block the slide, when you are dealing with someone who's been arrested. When you think about the actors, and one that I left off the slide, of course, would be the initial contact, the police officer, law enforcement. And that person is not worried about what's being left behind. Now, if the arrest occurs in the household, the officer might note there were 3 kids there, and that might actually lead to more charges, because if the reason why the person is being arrested is he or she struck his significant other and that was in front of the kids, that's cruelty to children. But assuming the arrest occurs outside the home, officers don't say, hey, tell me about your life. Do you have kids? Is there anyone I should notify? Maybe I could bring a sandwich to the, some food to the household. That their goal is get them in the back of the squad car and get them to the jail. But that first contact we'll discuss later on in a different setting where someone has been the victim of a shooting, at least in our jurisdiction, is a trigger for resources being sent to that household to help the kids deal with the trauma of a loved one having been shot. So when the loved one is a victim, our system jumps into action, which is great. That pipeline may be usable in the same way when the loved one, the caregiver, is the accused. But the focus is on that accused. The prosecutor is all about, you are a potential crime. And I'm not faulting the prosecutor, I used to do it. What's the right outcome here? Let me look at your criminal history, the severity of the offense, and hey, you left your DNA at the scene. It's a pretty strong case. And so here's how we're gonna handle this for you. What are the consequences for you, the offender? The judge sees even less information and is working through what's the right outcome here, but not thinking about what's happening on the outside. Most of the folks we're dealing with have public defenders. It could have said defense attorney, but the reality is, at least in our jurisdiction, 90+% of all of our criminal defendants are represented by our amazing public defenders. That's the person who's going to learn the most about the situation. Do you have kids? How are they doing? And so that person can advocate, and I hear it all the time in a sentencing, Judge, here's a reason why we should look for a program so she can get back out and help the household and help the family. And a judge should think about that as a reason to sentence more leniently or to go with probation rather than incarceration. Of course, that's ignoring the fact that if this person was in jail until resolution of her case, we're 6 months into it. And so the harm's already been done to that household. There is a new parent for that kid, if that kid's even in, or kids, if they're even in that household. But our focus is in on the case before us because we are trying to move those cases along. It's about case count and making sure we get stuff done. One of you mentioned before, hey, what about these other points of contact? There are other scenarios besides dad gets arrested or mom gets arrested that could have a traumatic impact on the child. And this chart, to me, has 2 important messages. One is the ripple effect of an incarcerated parent. That can cause additional trauma. The household may make it into civil court because now they're going to be evicted. It could lead to being in domestic court because mom says, you know what, the reason why dad got arrested or boyfriend got arrested is because he brought drugs in the household or he beat me up. And so there's a divorce or there's a change in custody. When we don't intervene, the child could end up in juvenile court. And so there are many points of contact in our court system. So don't leave here thinking, I don't know why I picked Churchill C. I should have been in Churchill D about unified courts because I don't even do criminal stuff. Well, so what? You may be active in a court, a part of the court where the impact of a caregiver having been incarcerated manifests itself where we should be thinking about it. But the other point of this chart is all the other places we should be looking for scenarios where a kid could be encountering trauma. And I gave that example of eviction. We have an amazing magistrate court And they would be open to the notion of gathering a little bit more data. Okay, the case is landlord versus tenant. And all they think about, well, there's this woman here, she's the tenant. Let's learn a little bit more about her household. Not because we're not going to evict you. If you haven't paid rent, you're going to lose your housing. But if you got 3 kids, then check that box, and that triggers some effects outside the court system for resources being directed towards those kids through their school, through wherever it is that they might be able to get additional care. It's not the magistrate court's job to say, here are some resources for this household, but it maybe is our obligation to sound the alarm that here's a situation that is causing trauma and hurtful health and mental health impacts for these children in this situation, but we don't tend to gather it. I took a tour. I had 2 interns this summer, and I took them to our county jail, which is infamous. If you follow Atlanta news, I don't know what the average is now, but it's a couple jail murders a month. Not a safe place. It's falling apart. And so you can, in your cell, usually find some piece of metal that you could pull off the wall and make a shank. It's a tough space. But we were touring it to see how intake works. And in talking with the different people who interact with someone who's just been arrested, so they're just walking into the jail, only one place was there any inquiry at all about, well, who are you leaving behind? They basically want to know, are you in a gang? Do you have tuberculosis? Where's the right place to house you in this jail while you're being housed that will be safe for you and safe for the rest of the people in jail? But the nurses who work there, who make sure you don't have tuberculosis, so it's okay for you to be in the jail, said, well, we do ask a little bit about the family. We said, well, we're working on this situation where we're trying to identify as soon as possible children who might be in need of care because the person you're interviewing just got locked up. And they were fascinated by that and said, we could gather that information. Now, we don't know if most kids go to the Atlanta public school system. We don't know if they're APS students or not, but we could get name and address and maybe the phone number of the new alternate care provider. Great, I don't need you to make that phone call. Gather that data and let's figure out a pipeline to push it through. You know, if I can say online, I'm going to New Orleans, and the next 50 times I'm on Google, there are ads for beignets, and the system can do that just because I said I'm going to New Orleans. Surely we can design a system that says, Robert McBurney was arrested. He's got a kid Calvin and a kid Roscoe, and that can allow someone else in our community to be reaching, those are my boys' names, reaching out to make sure Calvin and Roscoe are okay. And they're saying, sweet, Dad's not around. But that's not going to be everyone's reaction. And so this tells me that we have a lot of touch points where we can be gathering that data, to include the sheriff who runs our jail. And he wouldn't be the one collecting it. But some point during that intake process, let's get that additional information about the kids. You were looking excited about that slide. Did you want to add anything?
I'm excited about that slide.
All right.
That's one of the best slides. But let me get to the leadership piece, which is really kind of court administrators. And as a former court administrator, there was either two things you had to remember. Don't collect the data because you weren't asked to collect the data, because you might get in trouble if you start kind of uncovering trends that you have not cleared yet. And then the second, don't act like that's not true. That's true. The second is figure it out. And if you don't have the data, figure out how to collect it. That's really kind of where we shine, right? Is kind of figuring out what are the trends, what's happening in the system, sometimes strategically thinking about what to do with that information, and then consulting other leadership partners to be able to kind of make some big transformational change. So we put this gaps and opportunity slide here, kind of like what you were talking about in New Jersey, which is someone who is kind of responsible for navigating who are all these different partners and all these different courts and all these different players. How do we get data so that we start to make better data-driven decisions? The only reason we talk a lot about AI is because AI is learning from the data that we give it, right? So you got to find the data. You can't solve a problem if you don't know it exists. You can't build out trends, and you can't prove that it's happening in your jurisdiction. And for the most part, some courts, like we said, New Jersey and others, are starting to capture the data. But if we were to scale just kind of in this room writ large, how many of you are capturing this data in your jurisdiction? I see one hand.
What's your jurisdiction? All right. Does all of Florida, Fort Lauderdale, Florida is the answer. Is that unique to Fort Lauderdale, or statewide they capture information about unique?
Is unique to Fort Lauderdale. And what class of court?
Field
Like
visit.
field visit. We're going to Fort Lauderdale. I'll come.
There was one other hand.
Sorry, say that. Problem solving courts. Okay.
Okay.
There was a hand in the back.
So I'm from Louisiana.
Hold on one second.
Oh, I'm sorry. Hi, I'm from Louisiana, and we have. So I'm the judicial administrator for the Division of Children and Families at the Supreme Court for the state, and within my division is Families in Need of Services legal process, which we provide funding to state courts for. Part of the Families in Need of Services legal process is an informal side of that, where status offenders are coming in contact with the court system for the first time, and they can go through an informal process with an intake officer. Part of our intake process is asking these questions, asking about ACEs, asking about the family situation. And so that, I believe we are capturing some of this information so that we can best connect families to the resources they need through case managing. When a kid is missing school, for example, because a family member is gone away for whatever reason.
What is a status offender?
So status offenses are things that children get in trouble for just by virtue of being children. And in Louisiana, we have 10 different grounds in our law for those offenses. So it includes the most common are truancy, missing school, running away, being ungovernable, cyberbullying is one of them. There's, like I said, there's 10 different ones. So
Okay.
Anna.
Yeah, I think
Okay.
I think that's very important. And I think one of the things that we are trying to communicate here, especially around the data and gaps and opportunities, is to kind of break away from only capturing the data where you are dealing with families or children. What we're saying is it's a system issue. At any given time, you could have families impacted by the criminal, domestic. I mean, they could be everywhere. And often what we do in our courts sometimes is wait till they get to that space that is family or domestic or problem solving. And we're trying to kind of figure out how far upstream we can go. The other thing is system collaboration. When we first started doing these presentations, we did them with juvenile court judges, and they were all familiar with this. When we started to talk to general jurisdiction judges, criminal, felony judges, they were like, I think they do that in the juvenile system. And so what we're saying is, yes, they do, but we should have cross collaboration. Really, most jurisdictions don't even know who the community care providers are in their jurisdictions. They're not connected, but really kind of mapping out what those services look like is an opportunity, but also a gap. Training is great, but it's what type of training? Are you trained to actually see some of these things in your jurisdictions? And then finally, really kind of figuring out what points are early interventions. Now we're going to start going really, really fast because we wanted to leave 15 minutes for questions and engagement. We are there. And so I'm going to let Judge McBurney go through this slide, and then we'll kind of dial back and just want to hear what you're doing in your local jurisdictions and how you're connected to this issue.
Right. And I'm much more interested in the latter than this. This was my one animated slide, and all it says is we need to shift our focus outward as well, and in engaging with people who come into the criminal justice system. Don't just focus on them. Obviously, they're the actor and the one we need to deal with, but we need to be thinking outward as well. And one note, we have said this is all about the impact on kids. The reality today with the sandwich generation is that there are plenty of folks who are going to get locked up who have a parent in the household for whom they care as well. Different set of health concerns, more of a life and death one, if like they need to get mom or dad or grandma to dialysis. Those, in my experience, we tend to hear about right away because the person being arrested said, we need to figure out what's going to happen with this person, the elder. Our focus is on the kids. We need to worry about both. These are bigger numbers, the impact on kids, longer term impacts. And then you see that situation that I'm seeing where, as a prosecutor, I prosecuted 25 years ago Fred Smith. And now as a judge, I have Fred Smith Jr. in my courtroom as a defendant because we missed something. And it's not your fault. It's not my fault. We're catching it way too late. But that's why our focus is right here. Next slide. Oh, I flagged this early on. We do have some good data where we can try to prioritize where we put resources. This is the city of Atlanta broken down into neighborhood planning units, NPUs. Way back when, that's how they decided to divide it up, A through Z, except I don't think there's one letter they don't have, like I. But anyway, there are 25 NPUs. And the darker greenish is the highest rate of, that's where people go when they return from prison. That's one thing that they capture. When you leave our State Department of Corrections, you have to give an address where you're going to go with a zip code. And so we were able to, or the folks who put this together, were able to sort by zip code leaving the state prison system. And these neighborhoods, the darkest green and then the next darkest, are where people are coming home having been in prison. If they're going home to where their kids are, that's where the kids are who were left behind. And so as we're thinking in Fulton County about how to be strategic, which schools do we want to start engaging the guidance counselors in, the support counselors, or law enforcement, or other caregiving organizations, it would be the schools that fall in those NPUs. And your communities have a way to slice and dice. This is just a creative way of doing it. Food for thought as if we have sparked interest in you to explore this and maybe try to help the court system engage in this. This is one way that we could start building those connections. And that's all we're talking about here, is building that connection. This is not a plea to you all to build a new problem-solving court. You may already have one if you're Louisiana or Indiana. We don't, about how to work with those kids.
I'll just, two final things. We won't go through them in depth, but anybody heard of Handle with Care? Okay, so perfect. So Handle with Care is a strategy that came out of West Virginia, where they were really thinking about what do you do when a traumatic event happens, a police officer is called out to the house, and how do you kind of start to build out a network of information that allows the child to get access to care. I want to show you this because I think it's important when we talk a little bit, the next slide, which talks about what does Handle with Care, what would it look like in a court setting as kind of an example. So this model says that basically the child is exposed to a traumatic event. If an officer or police, law enforcement is called, that officer then takes the information, kind of does what they do on scene, but then they send a notice to the school that says nothing more than handle Dana with care. That's it. No what happened at the scene, no violation of HIPAA, none of the stuff. But what that then allows the school to do is to have teachers start to look at the child, make sure that they're not acting out and that behavior is not seen as delinquent, more so than they've experienced a traumatic event, and they might need a little care navigating some of those circumstances. If that works, they kind of go back into their school, their regular, normal daily life. If not, they go through a different set of strategies that includes counseling. If counseling does not help, then they bring in external therapeutic services that help the child kind of adapt. So Handle with Care is just a way for law enforcement, when individuals are experiencing children are in the home, whenever a traumatic event happens, to just notify the school to think about this a little bit differently. Now, what would that look like in a court setting? We don't know. We're testing it out and trying to figure out how to do that in a criminal matter. So, Judge, you want to go through this real quick, and then that will be our final slide? Sure.
It's just as soon as possible after arrest, it's starting to gather that data like you do with Handle with Care, and start to connect children and that household with the necessary resources. The add-on piece, and you mentioned that case I had a gentleman who was in one of my accountability courts who was terminated from accountability court because he'd been doing phenomenally well, and all of a sudden he got arrested for a burglary. No relapse, it wasn't relapse related at all. But because we turned to look away just from the offender to say what's going on in your life, it turns out he lost his job, and he was ashamed to tell the mother of his children and the kids in his household that he lost his job. He had his job for the first time in about 5 years because he had been sober as long as he had been in accountability court, lost the job, was ashamed, wouldn't say it, went back to his old hustle and was stealing copper from houses under construction, burglary, boom. And he's in custody. And because of his criminal history, he don't have a bond he can make. But when we get to dealing with what's the outcome going to be, because we're thinking more about the whole picture of this individual, the thinking is let's connect that household to resources. And he's got a benefit because he was in accountability court. He's got more wraparound services and there are ways to support the family. But the sooner we can gather data, just like with the handle with care, and figure out what pipelines. I think in Fulton County, it's going to largely be the Atlanta public school system because that's going to capture 98, and the county school system, but mostly the city one, that's going to capture 90+% of the kids.
So let's just talk about you and what's happening. Hi, I didn't know you were here. How are you? Okay. I love seeing friends.
Wow. So, I was actually going to ask to go back to revisit effects and disproportion.
Okay.
And then you threw the map up, and now I'm going to request that you do a study. So,
I'll do that in my free time.
I do agree that the effects and that the kids are affected. Mm-hmm. Probably the same initially, but disproportion is very important, and the map proves it because a child can be affected initially the same, but the environment they live in and affects them long term differently.
Yeah.
If you do the research, I don't even think I know, you will find that the dark green is going to be predominantly people of color.
It is.
The yellow is not. Yeah. Those kids growing up in the green and the darker green are going to be affected differently long term than the kids growing up in the yellow just by virtue of them being exposed to people not in yellow. Mm-hmm. And so as you move forward with this, you might actually want to look into that and then talk about it because disproportion makes a huge difference. When you have 70% people of color incarcerated, then their kids are going to be affected differently if they all live in the same community.
So, Howard, thank you for pointing that out. We're not discounting that at all. I think you're spot on with the disproportionality that happens in communities. Is seen across the board. Even, if you dig a little bit deeper into this, and we've done this in some of the work we're doing in Texas, is not only where some of the individuals are coming back to from prison, it is also where you see high numbers of arrests. You see high levels of poverty. You see high levels of all of the things that, we talked about are kind of these social determinants of health.
If we mapped out maternal mortality, infant mortality, the worst schools,
yes.
The average, the median income, et cetera, lowest, worst, you're exactly right. But again, what that tells me is let's start here. If we're figuring out a way to invest in this very small solution, it doesn't address all those other things. And the reality that maybe the role model for these kids is the gang that's there as opposed to dad or mom. But certainly if you pull dad or mom out of the equation, you've lost an influence. And so the sooner we can start investing in resources that would address the impact of that caregiver's incarceration, the better. But it is not a cure-all by any stretch of the imagination.
But one of the things, this is so important. The reason why we are not trying to have an independent justice conversations, because, of course, I've worked in this space for a very long time. People already know that. Anybody surprised? People already know that. What I think is important in our roles as courts is to start speaking in terms of health outcomes. Because when you start to think about health outcomes, you build solutions to make sure people are healthy and well and they stay alive. There's tons of money around that. Anybody got a blank check for fixing the justice system? Anybody got a blank check for that? Anybody build in tech for that? You see what I'm saying? And so part of it is courts now have to start adapting to situations that we're seeing. We know what's happening in communities, but now let's try some health models. Let's start speaking a language that connects health providers back to what we do every day and see if that might make a change. Because I shun to say, like, this is not new data. Folks know that this is kind of the issue. And I appreciate you saying, talking about the disproportionalities.
We have 2 minutes. We have one more question before we take your question. Other thing I want to push out there is that this is a situation where we have an opportunity to push data. This is a tricky pull data scenario for the reason Ms. Lewis gave. Doctors don't say, hey, has anyone been arrested in your household when the kid's having a annual checkup? If a kid even gets an annual checkup. But it's not the question that people typically ask. Hey, has there been an arrest in your household? It's awkward, maybe not be appropriate to ask, any number of reasons, but we know it happened in the court system. And so we can push that information out in a way where it might not naturally be pulled out. Yes, sir.
Is there any data or studies yet that show the effectiveness of the earlier intervention?
Yeah.
Oh.
Yeah, I mean, if you go back to the ACEs slide, it says ACEs, there is, therapeutic models around kind of responding to adverse childhood experiences. You all have heard of multi-systemic therapy, right? MST. You've probably heard of grief and trauma therapy, which is specialized. It's not just therapy, it is actually grief and trauma. It's very precise. Cognitive behavior therapy. The problem is not that there isn't evidence about early interventions. The challenge is, how do you get that intervention to the child far enough upstream before they engage the system?
Are you allowed to ask a question?
I have the chat for the online. It's an online question from Jeffrey Malata. He said, Judge, can you share a story from your own courtroom that represents a success story where early identification and connection to community care resources helped a child of an incarcerated parent avoid developing adult psychopathology or other problems?
I wish I could, but we haven't gotten good at this yet. And so the closest I came was the gentleman who lost his job, and at least we're going to treat that situation differently. But we don't have that early alert system in place yet. So if you invite me back in 5 years, I'll give you some examples.
And the last thing I will say as we end is I had an opportunity. If you don't know this gentleman, his name is Michael Phillips. He is extraordinary. Look him up. I had a chance to actually do a presentation with him, and he had experienced all these childhood traumas. And he, as we were on the panel, said this phenomenal quote that I take with me in all of this work, which is, the trauma that you don't transform, you transmit it. You transmit it in communities, you transmit it throughout your families, and you transmit it in our systems. And so we can help transform that. And I think this is an important conversation that we're just starting, but we really appreciate you taking the time to be engaged and a part of it.
It's an opportunity. Rise to the challenge.
Thank you for this insightful session. Thank you.